once again, what a wonderful conversation we have today to talk about the road to diversity beyond gender and through to full diversity. We have an absolute phenomenal panel today, and I'm not going to go into full bios because all of their bios were linked in the invite. But we have with us today David Evans, who's the Managing Partner of Watermark Search International. We have Caroline Waldron, Non-Executive Director at Southern Cross Care. Kate Russell, Director of Business Operations at the Department of Regional New South Wales and Border Director of New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. And Warrick Cramer, Innovator, Entrepreneur, Strategist and Executive. So welcome, first of all, to all of our panellists. Now we have a very interesting, once again, conversation to have today. As the title of the webinar suggests, we'll be really looking at board diversity in all of its forms today, not just gender, but of course including gender, but we'll also be looking at culture, at skills, at age, and at tenure and independence, which are also very important elements of board diversity. While the headlines continue to be dominated by the pandemic, and on that note, we send all of our thoughts and heartfelt care to everyone in the community who's being affected, whether that be physically, emotionally, or economically at the moment through the pandemic. But diversity issues will not only last well beyond the current crisis, but they will be an important part of addressing the crisis and addressing our resilience as a country and as an economy in the future. So we absolutely need to keep having these conversations and seeing real action on diversity in all its forms. Now, the Governance Institute of Australia and Watermark Search International have produced and released a report, the recent research findings of our report, which is called Board Diversity Index. And what that report shows is there is a greater gender balance for some organisations at board levels. So we are seeing some real positive signs. We're seeing growing levels of qualifications and diversity of qualifications, particularly among newer board members. And we're also seeing an increasing awareness that a more diverse board is good for business. So the business case is very solid and that's being well recognised. But as I think we all know, we certainly have a long way to go. We are nowhere near where we need to be or want to be yet. Now, just to let you all know as well, this webinar is being recorded for marketing purposes. So you can expect that you might see elements of it online afterwards, but no personal information will be shared. So first and foremost, I'd like to throw to David to explore some of the key findings of the index. David, over to you.
Thanks, Megan, and delighted to be here and continue our partnership. So we create this index. We've done it for 6 years now. We've got some really good data on how these things are tracking over that sort of time period. And we've looked at in commentary around gender. Naturally, that's heading in the right direction. I've got some more comments on that in a moment. But we've picked 5 areas of diversity, and we really feel that the conversation has moved on from only talking about gender. There's lots of other aspects of diversity that we want to table, discuss, bring to the limelight, and have people like yourself tune in and contribute to the boards that they're on. So the other 4 areas that we have looked at on the ASX 300 are cultural background, skills diversity, age diversity, and tenure and independence. So I'll just start with the first one, which everyone has some views and perceptions on. Next slide, if I can, on gender. I mean, the macro numbers are good. We are tracking in the right direction. There's been a 30% milestone goal for some time now, and we're really tracking towards that. And there's been a significant increase over the 5 or so years that we're seeing there. But what we really like to do with this index is dig a level deeper, and you'll see some stats on the right of your screen there around it. The ASX Top 50 are doing really well on this front, but as you work down the ASX 300, then there's some more room for improvement. And if we were to go another level down again, you'd see that correlation continue. But on the macro level, we are really heading in the right direction, albeit from a slower pace that we would like, or even a lower starting point. But the macro numbers look really good on that front, at least they're tracking well. So I can go on to the next slide around cultural background. This is something that I think we need to do a lot more work on personally, and hence why we've raised it. So on the left-hand side, there's some stats there that we've got saying roughly 30% of directors on the ASX 300 come from a non-Australian background. On the surface of it, yeah, that's not bad. But let's look at non-Anglo-Celtic. So if we take out Commonwealth countries, the UK, Canada, US, that sort of thing, then we're actually at 5%. And we don't think that's reflective of the society in which we're in or the customers that our ASX 3 companies are selling or offering services to. So I think there's a really big shift on that. And that's within reason pretty consistent across the 300. We are significantly behind. And if you look at the top right of the screen, we've actually gone backwards in the last 12 months on that. So although there's a lot more discussion around cultural background, the numbers say that we're probably not heading in a consistent trajectory that we at Watermark and the Governance Institute are happy with. So I'm sure we'll come back to that in the discussion. If I can go to the next slide, please, around skills. On the left-hand side, you'll see some stats there around there. The purple color is men, the aqua or teal color is women. And so more or less we're seeing that there's some greater diversity on the qualifications that people are bringing to boards. But also generally we're seeing that women, when they come onto boards, they're typically coming with higher or more qualifications. Again, there's another topic around to pack around on all that. And I think there was a time years ago where 90% of the board was made up of either accountants and or lawyers. We are starting to see that shift now, albeit slowly. There are certainly some more diverse skill sets coming to board, which is fantastic. Again, it's from a pretty low base, and more than a third of them coming from an accounting or finance perspective. But there is some discussion, and it's tracking in a positive direction, albeit slower than we would like. And then if I can go on to the next slide, please, around age and tenure and independence. This is a really interesting one. We've actually got a polling question for you later on in the webinar around the age and what we think is an appropriate age to come onto boards. But essentially, our board directors are getting older. Whether that's good or not, we'll ask your opinion on. There's lots of reasons for that, including we're living longer, healthcare is better, all those sort of things. But is that the right mix of what we're trying to do in terms of creating diversity and tenure on boards? And independence, again, is an interesting one, whether we're tracking in the right direction on that, for you to discuss and agree. This is a 30-page index. Feel free to download it and go through it. I've done my best to cover 30 pages and a couple of slides, but hopefully there's a couple of nuggets in there that we can get your thoughts on and discuss with the panel and go from there. Back to you, Megan.
Fantastic, and thanks so much, David. There really is such rich information in the report. I do encourage all of the participants on the webinar today to download that and have a look. And so now over to our panel, and I guess some general questions, and as you tend to do in Zoom land, I'll just randomly go through the Brady Bunch of my screen at the moment. But I might start just with some general questions around that. One of the questions that really is, I think, very highlighted in the media at the moment is we're seeing some really high-profile cases in recent times, which have brought up question marks over how some organisations are handling diversity and cultural issues, whether that be gender diversity issues and some high-profile cases of histories of sexual harassment, whether that be how organisations are dealing more deeply with their commitment to Black Lives Matter, whether it be how organisations are facing what we're seeing, which is a degree of both incidental or unconscious and conscious bias or racism at the moment with regards to our Asian communities because of the origins of the COVID virus, and we're seeing a bit of that in Australia. There really is this discussion that is very live at the moment. I might throw to you, Caroline, to start off with. What should organisations be doing to ensure they're conducting best practice in regard to all forms of diversity?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. It's great to be here. I think that, the story to date, as has been said so many times already in this last 10 minutes, is that the story has been about gender diversity. And it's really refreshing and hopeful, the question about all forms of diversity. And I think organizations who are serious about this and who really want to reflect their customers or their people and the communities that they serve, I think there needs to be firstly, an identification of the different types of diversity that exist, whether it's culture, skills, sexuality, ethnicity, all those other components that make up diversity. And then from there, I think one has to look at what the baseline, where are we today, do a report card of where the organization sits today, and then move on from there and set some realistic targets. Be realistic, but have some strategies in place that really measure those targets and report on it. I think, reporting is a really key part of it, because when you have to fess up and say, actually, we've done really well in this, or we haven't quite met the mark, but be honest. And I think that people are looking for leaders who actually not just talk the talk, but also who walk the walk.
Indeed, indeed. Warrick, what are your reflections coming from, I guess, particularly an international perspective as well?
Yeah, it's a really good one. I think it's definitely, there's a need out there from a diversity, and I definitely echo what Caroline just said as well. I think it just moved beyond just gender. And I think there's a lot of organizations now that are really, I think, embracing and the realization that a full set of diversity actually adds value to the organization, just beyond optics. And if you look at sort of research that's out there, like from the World Economic Forum, disruption innovation is only really driven successfully in organizations by bringing that diversity into the mix. And there's tons of research. I mean, like McKinsey as well, just recently released a report in May just this year, and they found that companies with executives teams that were diverse, they were 25% more likely to have a above average profit. So it really hits the bottom line, and also it keeps the organization fresh and keeping those ideas coming, because especially now with COVID, organizations need to innovate, they need to disrupt. And so how do you do that if you've got that monocultural sort of view where it's just this echo chamber of the one thought happening within the organization? So I think that whole diversity really, very much now front of mind for many organizations to go forward.
Absolutely. And Kate, I might throw to you. Obviously, we had talked previously, and you mentioned that you're getting a lot of calls of people, boards looking for candidates with an Indigenous background to represent more Indigenous diversity, which is great. What are some of the barriers to that? And are you seeing a real shift? And is that something that's happened in the last couple of years, or has it been a longer trend?
I'm definitely seeing a shift. But what I'm seeing is that the organisations that are particularly looking for Indigenous board members tend to have an Indigenous focus in their operations. What I'm not seeing is what I'll call mainstream organisations saying, it would be great to have an Aboriginal perspective, let's go and find that, which I think it's a really lost opportunity. I think there's a lot more work that can be done in this space, and I don't think that finding Aboriginal candidates is that difficult. I think a lot of the lessons that we've already learned from gender or from disability or from any other area are completely applicable to Aboriginal and First Nations peoples. It's about making sure that you have a different criteria, that you're a little bit more flexible in your approach. It's about building those connections from the ground up with community, working with an executive search firm that have those connections, because we have more tertiary graduates coming out that are Aboriginal now than we ever have before. Now, in saying that, they are a younger generation, so they're not at that 50-60 mark that we see where most board directors tend to be. But this is what I'm saying about being flexible in your approach. We have to foster that talent. Great board candidates don't grow on trees, whether they're Aboriginal or not. So it's about organisations, in my view, fostering that talent from within, whether that's having a high potential Aboriginal staff member shadow the board for a period of time, having Aboriginal people or groups present to the board on relevant matters, and building those connections with community, because it might take a little bit longer to find a great Aboriginal candidate, but it's worth it. And it's the same with finding a great candidate no matter what their background is. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of flexibility.
Yeah, so true. And look, we might actually throw to our first poll question actually at this stage, because it is, I think it's a real revelation for people to consider whether or not their board is having a conversation about diversity, but whether that conversation is extending beyond gender at the moment. So the first polling question that we're going to throw out to our audience is, what areas of diversity does your board or boards, if you're on multiple boards, discuss? Age, culture, gender, skills, tenure and independence. So we're going to have our first poll question go up on screen at the moment, and we might just wait a few moments for that. It's just popped up on my screen, and I'm going to fill that out. Oh no, hosts and panelists cannot fill that out. So I'm looking forward to the audience participation on that one coming through. And we might come back to that in just a moment, that first poll question. That's fantastic. So David, back to you in terms of some of the findings from the report. You obviously work with a broad range of companies. And are you really seeing that conversation taking place a lot more? Are you being asked in your search processes to look beyond just gender diversity at other forms of diversity? Is that a conversation that you're seeing come through your recruitment requests?
Not as often as we'd like, Megan. I mean, we're starting to see it, but a lot of it, in our experience, is actually suggesting to boards, have you thought about all the forms of diversity that we could look at or that we could assess, and what does your board make up, and what are the skills that would be accretive to what you've currently got, and getting boards and chairs to think a little bit more openly about that. And once we sort of put it on the table, then they're very receptive to go, and that's an excellent idea, let's look more about that. But they have to typically be prompted. You know, our experience of it is that gender is the great first shift in this, and it's probably the most easy to measure. But when we're talking about cultural background or skills or ethnic diversity, it's much more subjective and can be harder to measure, and people may or may not want to disclose that sort of thing. So it's going to take a little bit longer, but it's around having a goal around, okay, we've set a great benchmark on gender, we're moving towards that. But how do we set realistic targets around the other sides of diversity, and how do we make sure that we're fostering that both at board level and in leadership and across the organisation?
Fantastic. Caroline, I wanted to ask you a question. I mean, you sit on the other side of the table, you sit on a number of boards. What's your experience? Well, what was your experience, first of all, in getting a board role? Because it is difficult to get that first board role and build a portfolio. And importantly, have you experienced, unconscious bias in terms of hiring for boards, and what do you think are some of the mechanisms that people can use beyond traditional pathways to get those board positions?
Look, my board journey, it was very interesting actually, because I had to reflect on that many times in this last couple of years particularly, but I actually started actively mapping my board journey in 2004. And here we are in 2020, right? So it's 16 years ago. And it was after I spoke to a very senior eminent director, and he told me, he thought that I should think about that as a long-term career. So I went about mapping all my executive roles to make sure that I got the relevant functional experience to be an effective director. So I think one of the things that I'm very grateful for is that piece of advice, because it sort of broadened my executive thinking. And it took me to places that I might not have otherwise gone to. So that was one. So the board journey is very long, especially for people who think they might just jump off from an executive role straight into. It's not always there. There are people who've done it, of course, but generally it's a long one. I got both my board roles, and I've sat on a couple that have, for whatever reason we've sold off or whatever, but all my board roles have been through some sort of recruitment process. One is one where I responded to an advertisement, and the other two were search opportunities. So I think the search firms did a fabulous job in casting their net wider than the normal pool, if you like, and I was grateful for those opportunities. In response to your question on, and the other thing might I add, it helped to have networked with some of the directors in my path, if you like, along the way. And that was also really fundamental. So I think going in cold with no networking, even if you're on a search firm's list, is harder. So that networking is fundamental. In response to your question about unconscious bias, does it exist? It's one of those things, who knows, really? But I think the statistics speak for themselves. You know, the statistics show that, you know, there are less culturally different people, less Anglo-Celtic people, etc., etc. But probably what I will say is I read Gareth Evans, you've referred to it in your report actually, but Gareth Evans' bamboo ceilings presentation in full, and, you know, I think I'm with him on that. Bamboo ceilings exist. They are, you know, as pervasive as the glass ceiling, but they don't get as much attention. So I don't like thinking that I've got two ceilings at least over my head. It's not a good thing. But I think there are other people with more than two ceilings on their heads. I think that the challenge for us is to really focus on navigating those ceilings. How do we do it? And being aware that they exist, asking for help, talking to the right people, etc. In terms of non-traditional pathways, I guess there's always the headhunters, there's always the networking. I think building a critical mass of people with the right, with different skills, from different cultural backgrounds, etc., is really quite important. And on that point, you know, I'm heartened by countries like New Zealand, where they've got the Super Diversity Institute, and they've got a ready-made pool of incredibly diverse talent, and that whole section is about intersectionality. That whole group is about intersectionality, very, very powerful, and it breaks homogenous thinking. So I think there are some clear strategies that we can take in Australia.
Yes. Look, we might throw to the results of that first poll now, if we can, to the Watermark team. If you can throw up on screen the results of that first poll and see what boards are thinking about at the moment. So diversity of skills is really coming out very highly. They are sputtering on age and culture, tenure and independence, more so once again, and gender, as we might expect, in about 63% of cases. And so I wanted to talk to you, Warrick, particularly about, you've obviously, you know, got this really broad international experience, particularly in Silicon Valley. We talked offline about where Australians thought we were and where we really are. And I wondered whether you might reflect on that, given your international experience, and also just give us a flavour of where this debate is sitting in terms of some of the international roles that you hold as well.
Sure. Look, I think I just want to sort of cover this off by saying this is my personal observation. Okay, so I'll just start off by saying that. I think it's, you know, I have recently returned back to Australia, and my sort of view has been a little bit mixed coming back. You know, I've seen that there is a lack of diversity in Australia. I think the stats, you know, speak for itself, speak volumes there. But I also think that it's a huge opportunity as well. And I see this where, and if I just take back my own sort of journey there, in my last role, there was, I think, 50 odd nationalities in my team. And just in terms of the richness of thought, the problem solving was just incredible. And I personally learned so much from that. And so I think it can be very, very, you know, enriching in that respect. And also, if you look statistically, and I think I touched on before, but, you know, all the research is pointing out that, you know, there is an increase, there's a financial impact on the organisation to increase profitability by having that well-rounded view. See what's sort of happening around you in terms of some of my experiences on the board at a VC in Silicon Valley. You know, we removed, which is really interesting, we removed name, age, gender and schools from the application process. And what we found was that there was 75% of our portfolio are companies that have women, Hispanic, and Black founders on there, right? We never imagined that for a second when we did that. And then we decided, you know, we had the discussion of the board saying, oh, well, you know, guys, let's go and put together a diversity fund because there's something there. And we had major pushback from women in the community. And, you know, they basically said, well, we don't want to be seen as a diversity play. You know, and they were concerned that if they received funding from a diversity fund, that they wouldn't be able to get follow-on funding from future investors. So it's really interesting, and I'm sorry, Megan, I've sort of gone a little bit off track there with the answer there, but the point I'm sort of trying to make is that around the rest of the world, there is, front of mind for everyone that, diversity does matter. And there is a big push in terms of just taking it beyond just gender, but the wide sort of gamut of what diversity means in the community, and having that sort of cross-sectional view. So, and it does make good business sense, and it does drive value to the organisations. Am I seeing it here as much in Australia? Probably not. And I don't know if that's reflective of just our culture, whether it's just conservative, whether you just go with the usual suspects. I think I mentioned earlier when we were sort of before joining the call was having that sort of board tourism where you have the board members that just move around from board to board to board. So not injecting new ideas and new thought into that process. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. And I think if organisations begin, I suppose, to open up, I think they'll see the richness of what comes from that as an organisation and make them more, I suppose, competitive and deliver more some more positive results for them.
Yeah, and look, you raised such an incredibly, I think, important part of the conversation, and that is, I think, generally speaking, we appreciate where we are, which is not particularly great, in terms of having diverse and inclusive boards, much less more deeply in our organisation, and that's another topic of conversation probably for another day because we're focused on boards here, but. We know generally speaking where we are, and the Watermark research obviously has given us that strong indication. We know generically where we'd like to be. We know that we'd like to be much better than we are today, but the road to get there is very murky because some of the mechanisms like reverse discrimination and what people would describe as reverse discrimination, I would probably describe as evening out the playing field. But some of those tactics can cause a lot of angst. So, for example, a lot of women, for example, would be against quotas because they don't want to be seen as getting there because of a quota and not on their merit. And I think that's exactly what you've described, Warrick. We might go to our second poll question, and our second poll question is really centered around this, and that is, does your board discuss, if your board is discussing the benefits of diversity, are they doing so to really understand the benefits of diversity and inclusion in the organisation? So are they doing that to educate themselves around why that's a good thing and what they can do to get there in a really deep researched way? Or are they discussing it to meet a quota or a target that you've set internally for your organisation? So we might throw that second poll question up right now. And if audience members, and while you're doing that, we're already getting some fabulous questions coming in from the audience using the Q&A function on Zoom. So keep those coming in. I'm going to continue on a little bit of interview with our panelists for another 10 minutes or so, but there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A from the audience. So please let those questions keep coming in. That's really great to see. So I think that we've had that poll question go up, or it's just going up at the moment. And we'll just give a moment for that to happen. Let me see, I'm just jumping between screens. So while we're waiting for that next poll question to come through, I might jump back to you, Kate. Obviously we've talked about your particular passion, and one of the things that we talked about, and you mentioned it a little bit more in your previous comments, but that creation of pipeline and visibility of pipelines, so that we're not just having board tourism where you have 2 or 3 high profile, for example, Indigenous leaders that jump from board to board to board or sit on multiple boards in the mainstream in particular, as we start to see more Indigenous diversity in mainstream boards. But what are some of the thoughts that you have in terms of how we A, create the pipeline, and B, make that pipeline much more visible?
Sure. And look, I think there is a challenge when we are talking about Aboriginal people that we are 3.3% of the population. Statistically, that is a very small talent pool, particularly when you look at the age structure of our population. We tend to be probably much older or much younger. I think something like 30% of the Aboriginal population in Australia is sort of under 25, so probably not in the position to be starting their board career. So as we said before, that pipeline is there. We've got higher tertiary graduates than ever before. There can be things like identifying talent from within the organisation and having them spend time or shadow a senior executive, whether it's, if you have a suitable internal pipeline, making sure that there's an Aboriginal person, like we do with women, an Aboriginal person on every shortlist, considering them for acting opportunities, having them shadow the board, having Aboriginal staff or staff groups come and spend time with the board to present on relevant matters so that they get a feeling for what a board is. Because I think for anybody, until you're in that room, you just have no idea what it's like, and it can be quite intimidating. So to give Aboriginal people an experience and to understand that it's not necessarily as daunting as you might think it is, and to see if that is something that they would consider, because like women, Aboriginal people have this imposter syndrome, and they probably don't always necessarily feel comfortable or feel that that's something for them. So we have to encourage them to get a foot in the door so that they can actively choose to tap into a board position or not when they are approached with an opportunity.
Indeed.
Just to add to that, the organisations that we've seen do it well have had a distinct focus on it, and including Indigenous Australians, but all forms of diversity around. It's our responsibility in society and as stakeholders of our company to develop people to come up through the ranks. And many of the people, to Kate's point, don't actually know what opportunities are ahead of them or even within possibility for them. So organisations have a clear focus on it. And there was another report recently that KPMG did. They're saying one of the biggest levers on this was the chair. If the chair is driving this at the boardroom table, then it filters to other conversations in the CEO and the CFO and the company secretary, then that filters down as well. But we are finding with this one, it has to be a typical focus from the chair and the CEO in order to have that impact that we're seeing all the way through the organisation.
Yeah, fantastic. And so, look, I'm going to come back to you, David, because we've got a question on the actual survey itself and on the index itself and how background diversity was measured. So I'll leave that one for you to just think about. But before we do, we might go to our poll response on that second poll. And that is, if your board's talking about diversity, are they really delving deeper, or are they talking about it to meet a quota? And look, really pleasing there, I think, with our respondents, both is, both or is the answer. Probably meeting a quota, a little bit ahead of discussing the benefits more deeply. Although I would suggest that to an extent, both are relevant. It can be a bit of a chicken and egg. I know that when the Workplace Gender Reporting Agency first started gathering data, and we had a conversation in my previous industry sector that I dealt with, questioning, what was the value of the data. And of course, a lot of people talk about how passionate they are about diversity, but if you don't understand your data, I'd probably claim that you're not passionate at all, because those things that are important to us, we measure in our business lives. So that's fantastic, that poll. So David, over to you. We had a question, as I said, keen to understand how you measured cultural diversity. Did you assess people's background, going through their board bios and where they're from, etc.? If you can unpack that for us.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and it's a point that I sort of touched on earlier is around, gender is reasonably easy to measure, and so we can sort of put a line in the sand around that. The other aspects are much more difficult, and that's where we're finding it that the shift on boards and leadership is typically slower, because it's a little bit more difficult to measure. But in answer to the cultural background question, what we looked at was people's backgrounds, where they grew up, where they went to school, where they've worked as well, and their sort of family heritage. And then we've made typically a judgment call on that, whether they're involved in or bring a sort of different cultural perspective to the table. But cultural background is really difficult to measure, and some board directors we've seen and interviewed, to one of the points was made saying, I don't want to disclose that because I don't want to be seen as the diversity play. And if that is why I'm here, then I'm going to withdraw from the process. So we're still on that cusp of whether people are saying that it's really of value to them, but people, to your point, Megan, want to get there on their own merit, regardless of the background.
Fantastic. So look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of you another question here. We've just got so many aspects of diversity that we're covering in this conversation, so we are jumping around a little bit. I wanted to focus at the moment on skills and background of experience diversity. So we are obviously seeing boards continuing to value financial and accounting and legal skills, but human resources and change management skills are coming much more to the fore. Is this a problem that we should be addressing, particularly when you consider culture being such a driver of corporate activities? So, for example, we've seen in the most recent Royal Commission with the financial services sector that culture has such an impact on performance in organisations. Do you think that we should be seeing more directors coming through with this cultural dimension, this dimension of understanding human resources, diversity in all its forms, and change management skills? Caroline, I might start with you, and I'll go through my Brady bunch. So Caroline, Warrick, and then Kate.
Yep, thank you. Look, absolutely. I mean, culture is everything. I think that's been a phrase that's been used quite a lot. Organizational culture is everything, and it does definitely emanate from the top. And I think that getting people with the technical skills, the HR change management transformation skills to support that, and CEOs who've actually been in that space are gold in this time. So I would say yes, absolutely, we should be looking for that. They are rare, but more than just getting the HR skills and more than just getting somebody with the technical skills, it's somebody who's actually sort of looked at really had some runs on the board in terms of transformation, not just knowing what it involves, but being involved, whether it's transformation through introducing new technology, because that has got such big cultural ramifications, or people involved in organizational change, I think is what we're talking about. So we should be looking, but let's not forget also that for a board director to be effective, they've actually got to have a very clear and reasonably robust understanding of accounting and the commercial framework within which we operate. So I think it's still about the combination of skills. So you might look for somebody with a specialty, but with that real rounded focus, I think that's when you're going to get the A-class director.
Mm. Warrick, over to you.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think definitely cultural from a board perspective, I think is very important, but I think also looking at board members, sort of that whole ecosystem and what sort of backs into that as well, I think it's just as important. Understanding that you've got the transformational skills, digital skills, etc., that are now changing and moving in a different direction and sort of putting different emphasis within organisations. I do agree with you that you do need to, as a board director, have a well-rounded sort of skill set, like any CEO, etc. But I think, yeah, just looking, I think I go back to the sort of the ecosystem play, because I think those networks also are very important, because you need to be able to draw on those, because sometimes you don't have all the answers. And so you need to be able to rely on those networks and that ecosystem to be able to go out there and find, what's necessary out there in the marketplace. It's interesting because coming back as an expat also, and I talk to many expats and part of different sort of groups, etc. And there is still a reluctancy here in Australia as well, that expats, that with that global perspective, can add value to a board, because there's a understanding, well, you don't understand the local market, or you haven't worked here in Australia, so you don't know what happens here locally. And so I think that also from a board perspective, but just park aside sort of some of the other topics there, I think that's a really big part that's really can add that value in there, because, from a transformational point of view at a global perspective, it's done, very, very differently. And I think when a board sort of injects, once again, these sort of different viewpoints, I think they become more valuable and stronger and more resilient to deal with sort of the different sort of issues that pop up as they do in any organisation.
Yes, I think that's true, particularly currently, obviously, we're facing an environment where we've got some physical trade and migration limitations, but the world is becoming smaller and smaller despite nationalistic tendencies at the moment. And for organisations in Australia to consider international strategies, they have to have that international experience and understanding that cultural understanding directly on board. So it's such an important point. Kate, what are you seeing in this area in your travels? I'll have to take you off mute there, Kate.
Oh,
there we go.
that's right, fabulous. So if we're seeing that boards continue to prioritise finance and accounting skills and human resources and change are underrepresented, I do see this as problematic, and I agree with my colleagues in the fact that we want to have well-rounded board members, but what we've touched on today is that we also have to be flexible. And quite often, I'm sure, David, in your work, you'll get a very long list of essential requirements for any board role, and sometimes they're impractical. To find such a candidate is just not always going to happen. I think if we look at the generation of people that are starting or are active in board careers in Australia, we have finance and accounting for that generation is probably typically masculine. HR and change was particularly feminine. We don't have a huge amount of Aboriginal graduates in the finance and accounting sectors, and if we're going to really focus and drive those skills, we're not going to have that diversity that we think. So for me, in my perspective, we do need to be flexible. We might not have someone with 15 years HR experience or a CPA. We might have to be a little bit more flexible in our approach if we want to have a diversity of thought. And when we talk about culture, it's beyond Aboriginality or beyond background of culture. It's also just about fit. It's about having the right person who can come in and have a challenging but respectful conversation, who can bring something different to the table. And sometimes they're not necessarily a finance graduate, or they're not necessarily a CA. They might have a completely different background, a mix of skills. And from my perspective, I think that's much more beneficial for a board than having someone who fits a cookie cutter board essential criteria form.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, and once again, we're jumping back and forwards across diversity categories, if you like. We have had a great comment that mentions that we're certainly not talking about diversity not taking into account gender, or saying that it's just gender. We know that we're not there yet with gender. We know that I've been saying this for a long time. At 52% of the population and 54% of the university educated population for almost 3 decades. We're nowhere near where we need to be on gender, and it definitely is a plus argument. And I think also from my experience, when you start opening up the deeper understanding of the institutional and structural and unconscious barriers to female participation and promotion, you actually start opening up a conversation about inclusivity in all its forms. And so there are corollary benefits from talking about just gender or gender in isolation that go across all diversity groups. But of course, we have to think about all of them. I'm going to throw to the last of the polling questions at the moment. And then, Caroline, we've got some great questions. People are very interested in your comments about mapping your journey. And I think there's a little bit, you could probably run another 1-hour webinar on what you mean by that. But we do have some questions on that. So I might come to you on just exploring how you did that a little bit more functionally. But we might go to the last of our poll questions. And this really considers age. It's a really important one. So should we consider board directors under 50, over 50, or age does not matter? So this is the last of our polling questions. Under 50, over 50, or age is irrelevant. And so we'll pop that one up for our audience to participate on. And while they're doing that, Caroline, perhaps you could expand on your mapping journey a little bit more.
Sure. Look, so when I started that in 2004, my background is in law. So I trained as a lawyer. I was born in Malaysia and I studied in England and actually was a barrister, but then went on to become an M&A lawyer. So there was a few sort of steps in between, but that's where I landed. And went, after I had children, became a general counsel in-house. And when that happened, you become sort of open to all the other forms of leadership in an organization. And as part of that, a particular CEO gave me the opportunity to be the head of HR. And I embraced that and thought, I really enjoyed it. It was something completely different. I wasn't really trained in it, but I realized that I could apply myself and, learn new skills along the way. And when it was suggested to me that perhaps I should think about a long-term career as an ed, I decided that I had to get those other functional skills. And my next role took me, and one of the best ways to do that was to get into a boardroom as an executive. And I went on to become the company secretary and general counsel of another publicly listed company. And it was there that I actually became, went on and did the Governance Institute course, and realized, there was a whole new other world available. And for 7.5 years, that's what I did. I sat in a boardroom and I learned as much as I could. But also during that time, I was privileged because I was asked to lead risk and internal audit for that company, for David Jones. I was at David Jones. It was an ASX 100 company, and what an opportunity that was. So it was that kind of thing where I started to piece the various parts of my career together. And after I'd finished that, I looked at my CV and I thought, right, I'm missing marketing. And I saw that as being really quite an important skill to have. So I went on and sought a marketing role, and Norton Rose Fulbright gave me that opportunity to be Chief Marketing Officer. So it was kind of really looking for the opportunity, but also making it known to my network and looking for the pieces that could help me get there.
And I think that networking piece is such great advice, and thanks for the plug for the Governance Institute of Australia courses. I mean, we have had the discussion around not everyone graduates from their original degree with accounting or law. However, the aspects of those that you need for governance can be covered in postgraduate education or other post your original degree education. So definitely would encourage people to look out for how both formally through education that they can flesh out those skill sets, but also, as you've mentioned, putting yourself outside of your comfort zone and taking on roles where you don't necessarily have a background and will be exposed to these other areas. You can develop a wealth of knowledge. I know in my experience, I sit on a number of boards. I have to be across the legalities and obviously the statutory reporting and accounting obligations as you do as a director. I'm also a CEO. My background was in marketing and teaching, so I had to flesh out and seek opportunities to learn those skills both formally and informally through networks. So that's certainly true of my career. And Warrick, and I can assume that you're the same. Not everyone graduates from everything. You have to flesh out those skills, and you do a little bit through formal training, a little bit through networking and knowledge sharing.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've got a marketing background, and I ended up being a CEO for Vodafone, looking after all the innovation, and that was a very well-rounded sort of role. And then historically running my own business, where you have to wear multiple hats. So, and you have to know every aspect of what you're doing. So definitely having that well-rounded view, and I totally agree with you, Caroline, is really, really beneficial when you go to a board role, because you need to look at a very holistic view as to what's happening with within the organisation, and know where to delve down and go deep to peel back and sort of expose and confront some of the challenges that the organisation might be facing.
Now, we've had an absolutely phenomenal question come through from one of our listeners today, one of our participants, who first of all comments that he's an Asian Australian and tends to agree with the bamboo ceiling being a reality. So that's an interesting comment. But the question is actually around people with disabilities and whether or not that is getting enough airplay in terms of the general D&I conversation at boards, whether we are being truly inclusive of those Australians that suffer disabilities, and international candidates for that matter that suffer from disabilities. David, I might start with you. Are you getting any commentary or seeing any movement in that space?
Nowhere near enough is the answer to me. I mean, we partner with a couple of organisations that support services in that sector, and they're absolutely on the radar with that. But for the broader economy or broader companies, then no. And it's not until we bring it to the table and said, have you thought about or have you considered? that boards are starting to go, actually, no, and we like that suggestion, we'd like to do something around that. And it doesn't mean that you need to necessarily appoint someone who has a disability or comes from a disabled background. It's more that the conversations at the table and we're talking about it, and then it's on the radar. And then maybe that doesn't happen at the boardroom table, but maybe that happens at the next meeting with the CEO, or then maybe that happens at another level down the organisation. And all of a sudden, more and more discussions create some more action. But that's a really slow burn.
If I could jump in, David, I think one of the challenges that there is so much invisible disability. I would agree. In my experience, disability, I mean, I sit on 3 non-profit boards, 2 of them working actively in the disability space. So look, I am probably the exception, not the rule, but I would say generally there probably isn't a lot of consideration given to people with disability or even carers at the table. But when we're going and doing studies, and as you said yourself, sometimes you have to look at people's bio and make an assumption. Unless someone has a visible disability, we just don't know. 20% of Australia has a disability. Now, in saying that, the huge proportion of those people are in the older brackets. The older you are, the more likely you are to have disability. But it's not receiving the attention, but it also is hidden and really difficult to track. So many people don't want to disclose for various reasons and have that uncomfortable conversation. But I think it's something that we need to do better in Australia.
Yeah, it's incredible. I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday who I've known for a very, very long time, but I never knew until yesterday that they're colourblind. And I was talking about my penchant for traffic light reporting and using colour coding in board papers. And it's one of those things that I wonder if a director has ever said, look, might be really helpful to everyone else, but it's actually not helpful to me, or maybe even makes it more confusing to me because the colour coding, I'm missing that piece of the information. And so many people in Australia are colourblind. It's just a really practical example of exactly what you're saying. If people don't raise it, it's never a topic of conversation. And yeah, just really interesting example that happened just yesterday for me. We might come to the result of our polling question on the age of directors. This is such an interesting one. So under 50 is a bit of a focus, and age does not matter is the clear majority. And it's such an interesting topic of conversation. And I think that one of the things that I wouldn't mind asking each of our panelists is to just talk about strategies for inclusivity in the boardroom. We've talked offline about diversity being one part of the equation, but inclusivity is really such a fundamental part of embedding the benefits of diversity. And we were having a conversation around, for example, getting the young person on the board, or the young professional representative, or whatever you might call it. And I witnessed a circumstance where we had a young professional come onto a board that I was on some years ago, but then so much commentary was made around the board table. Yes, we used to think that like that when we were young, or yes, I guess your generation would think like that, or when you get a few more years of experience, you'll change your mind on that one. And eventually that young person stopped talking around the table because they felt that their view was devalued through those comments, and they were not consciously biased. They were not meant to disrupt. They were just unconscious comments that were made that devalued that young person's contribution to that board. So I'm wondering whether each of you might reflect on some of the work that boards need to still do on conscious and unconscious bias, so that they're really thinking about inclusivity in board conversations and reaping the benefits of the diversity that we're talking about, rather than it being tokenistic. I'm going to go really quickly across because we've only got 5 minutes left. David, I'll start with you, and then a couple of thoughts across the panel. David, Kate, Warrick and Caroline to finish off with.
In our experience, it's the board, it's the chair of the board that really drives this. It's around encouraging people to speak up. It's around taking that thought and really discussing it amongst the board members and not being dismissive of those comments. And the chair really sets the tone. And I think that if that continues to happen, then that filters across other boards as well, and other directors sort of take it. But in our experience, the biggest lever on that is the chair encouraging people and board directors to speak up, because that's really their role on that board, is to come from a different perspective.
Okay.
Look, I think the Diversity Council Australia has done some really great work on what actually is inclusion, and it's about being respected, feeling connected. It's about the ability to progress and the ability to contribute. From a personal perspective, I would say what makes inclusion at the board level, it would be because somebody fits a special box or has a special skill, we would never just call on them to be the subject matter expert on that one area. As an Aboriginal woman, I don't want to be oh, there's an Aboriginal question, Kate, what's that? Or we have a question about women, Kate, can you please answer that? We would never do that with someone who's got a marketing background. We would have a broad, robust conversation where potentially the person with lived experience or a particular subject matter area expertise would contribute more, but it wouldn't become that tokenistic, oh, we have someone who can answer that question. So I think it's really about, as David said, it's about the culture, and that is driven by the chair.
Warrick?
You know, the inclusion, it's a really good topic because I think it comes down to, you know, I suppose, yeah, the culture of the organisation, absolutely. But it's also if you sort of peel it back also, thinking about the organisation really understanding their customer, and is their customer being represented on the board? And you know, or is it just you know, people getting together? It's so disconnected from the end user, and really, what's through COVID, what's been highlighted more is the digital skills or lack of skills, should I say, at the board level, and understanding how do you still connect, you know, to your customer from a digital perspective, and even just interact with your team. That sort of division has really been very apparent in a lot of organisations and boards. So I think you just have to look at it from a wider context as well, and from an inclusion play. And just finally, just to sort of say, you know, one of the things that we did in the Valley was, you know, around a lot of the inclusion, diversity sort of topics around that, was that we started getting people to put photos of their management team and board members on the website. And that just spoke volumes. We didn't have to have the discussion anymore, right?
Yeah.
Because it was visual, and people could come to their own conclusions as to what they were actually seeing, and that visual representation. So I think, you know, just thinking it through different ways of trying to tackle the problem.
That's fascinating and such a good point. Caroline, last words for you.
Look, I think two things that directors need to think about when they are around a boardroom table is to have courage, and about inclusivity, to have courage and to really sharpen their listening skills. So the courage to speak and the listening skills to understand. I think those two things are really important. Some people talk a lot at board meetings. Are they actually listening to the others who are quieter? And I think if that dynamic, and the chair has a key role in that regard, if that dynamic can be balanced carefully, then I think you've got a very powerful board.
Fantastic. Well, look, we are just about out of time. It's been a really fascinating conversation. Look, thanks to all of the participants that logged on and came online today to participate. We haven't got to all of the questions, but we've got to a fair few of them. There is still so much that we could discuss, but it's a really important conversation that we still need to keep having. We still need to keep taking it forward. Now, if you wish to access a copy of the Board Diversity Index, it can be downloaded either from the Watermark website or the Governance Institute of Australia website. So please feel free to go onto either of those websites and download a copy of the report. As I said, it's really fascinating reading when you drill into the detail. Once again, a huge thank you to our panelists today. A virtual round of applause to David, Caroline, Kate and Warrick. Wonderful contributions that you make, not just today in our conversation, but to this agenda more broadly. And so I thank you very much for that. And thanks very much also to Watermark for producing this index and partnering with the Governance Institute of Australia. It's an issue that's very important and dear to my heart. It's something that the Governance Institute is really focused on, because good governance is diverse and inclusive, thought-led governance. It's such an important aspect for us to have well-governed societies and organisations. So on that note, it's 1 o'clock and we will sign off from this webinar today. Thanks so much for everyone for joining.
Thanks all.